Questions without notice. Are there any questions? And I give the call to the Honourable the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, yesterday I visited a food manufacturer in the Yarra Valley that has seen its energy bill skyrocket by $200,000 since Labor came to office. This is why Australians are paying more at the checkout. Given that not a cent of the Prime Minister's so-called energy bill relief fund has gone to a single small business or family, why is Labor ignoring the suffering caused from the ongoing cost of living crisis?
The order. The Prime Minister will be heard in silence. He has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. It is indeed the one-year anniversary of the member for Hume's decision to hide energy price rises. You acted to hide price rises. We acted to shield families from them. We acted to shield families from them, and you voted against it. You voted against it. You voted against shielding families. Voted against shielding small businesses. And Claire Savage, the chair of the Australian Energy Regulator, said this about the DMO: "It's much lower than where we were fearing. It could have been last September, October." A lot of what we have seen in the price increases today have been driven by unreliable coal plants, so outages and very high fossil fuel prices. So that transition to clean energy is critical to bringing down prices. Mr Speaker, those opposite voted against direct bill relief to those Australians who need it most. They voted against price caps that have already had an impact on price increases. They opposed the safeguard mechanism, their own policy. They took 4 gigawatts out of the grid and only put 1 gigawatt back in. They announced 22 energy policies and didn't land a single one. And the louder they yell, the more embarrassed they are by their own performance. The louder they yell, the more embarrassed they are, Mr Speaker. We on this side of the House gave those opposites an opportunity last December to stand with, not just with the federal Labor government, but with the New South Wales Liberal government and vote for lower
the Prime Minister will
prices.
pause. Has the Prime Minister concluded his answer? I give the order. There is far too much noise on my left. The member for Fairfax. I want to hear from the member for Canberra.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Employment and Workplace Relations. What impact have the Albanese Labor government's policies had for women wanting to work full-time?
The call to the Minister for Employment, Workplace Relations and the Minister for the Arts.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Canberra for the question and acknowledge the member for Canberra's strong advocacy wanting to remove the barriers that make it harder for women who want to work full-time to be able to take up that opportunity. Under the Albanese Labor government, more Australian women are now getting into full-time work than ever before. Our first 12 months of government delivered the strongest jobs growth for any new Australian government, 330,000 jobs, but a record high number of women are joining the workforce too, 163,900 more in the last 12 months. If you look at the total figures of this jobs boom over the last 12 months and think that these figures involve 4 different categories: men working full-time, women working full-time, men working part-time, women working part-time. And across that full set, 57% of the new jobs are women working full-time. 57%. Now, you don't get a change like that through some coincidence. You only get a structural shift like that because there are structural shifts happening in the rules for work in Australia. This government created the opportunity which allowed more women who wanted to work full-time to do so when it made those changes. When it delivered stronger gender pay equity laws, it delivered more options for women. We delivered more options for women wanting to work full-time when we backed pay increases, including the 15% pay increase in the aged care sector, a heavily feminised sector. When we stood in last year's annual wage review and this year's annual wage review for a real wage increase for low-paid workers. where we have stood against all the arguments and excuses that we dealt with for years and now are in the process of implementing all 55 recommendations of the Respect at Work report. This government created more options for women who want to work full-time when we passed laws to make childcare cheaper and more accessible for 96% of Australian families. When we delivered the biggest boost to paid parental leave since the scheme was introduced by Labor in 2021. When you change the law to remove the barriers, you start to get the figures that we're now seeing. When you change the laws to provide flexibility in the workplace, you start to find that many women who wanted to work full-time, who previously couldn't, now can. And as we work towards legislation later this year, where we remove further loopholes to create a workplace situation which makes it easier for people to get into the workforce, we'll continue to see a change of government, meaning a change of opportunity for women wanting to work full-time.
Order. I want to hear from the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. In silence.
My question is to the Prime Minister. On 97 occasions before the last election, the Prime Minister promised to reduce every Australian's power bill by $275. But the government's own budget papers say that power prices will rise by 10%. And last week, the energy regulator said that on July 1, prices will rise by as much as 25%. Prime Minister, how on earth can power prices rise by 25% but fall by $275?
Give the call to the Prime Minister.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker.
Order.
I thank the member for her question, and I note that the member voted against energy price bill relief. Voted against it in this chamber. And I note also that if you compare what was predicted to be the price rises in the October budget and compare it with our budget papers, you'll see that our action in putting price caps on coal and on gas energy have made a substantial difference, and that's what and that's what the experts all say. But I'm asked about cheaper energy, and I have seen a proposal for cheaper energy, Mr Speaker. I can inform the House that I've seen a proposal for free electricity, Mr Speaker. Free. Because the member for New England had to say this about nuclear power. I say, how about we do this? If you can see it, your power is free. You know what I think a lot of your listeners would do? They'll say, paint it red and put it on a hill so I can have a good line of sight to it. But it wasn't just a one-off, Mr Speaker. It wasn't just a one-off, because the member for Hinkler came in. And he said this.
The member for Hinkler.
In my view, and this is just my view, it has to go to a community that supports it. Because we know the big problem with them is they have this policy. And I know the Leader of the Opposition has problems with costings policy, but there's a costing here. Big one. Do I think...
The Prime Minister will pause, and the Deputy Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
On relevance, Mr Speaker, it was a tight question. How can power prices rise by 25% but fall by $275?
Order. Resume your seat. The Prime Minister is being relevant regarding power bills and energy prices. I'm listening to his answer carefully. In continuation, the Prime Minister has the call.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker, because this quote's a cracker about how things can cost something but apparently be free. Because in spite of the fact the Leader of the Opposition doesn't believe in costing policies, here's one. Do I think there are communities out there that want a $10 billion facility? There's a costing for you. $10 billion for a small nuke plant, and potentially want to get free electricity for everyone who lives inside of that nuclear reactor. So there you go. It's going to cost $10 billion, but the energy's free. Why didn't we think of that?
Give order. The Treasurer will cease interjecting, and so will the Assistant Treasurer. So I can hear from the Member for Aston.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. What are the impacts of the global inflation challenge, and how is the Albanese government's budget and economic plan helping to address price pressures in our economy?
Order. The Treasurer has the call.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for Aston for her question, and also can I thank her community for sending someone of her character and calibre to work with us on their behalf here in the People's House of the Parliament.
Order.
Mr Speaker, we know that a lot of Australians are under the pump. We know that inflation remains the biggest challenge facing our economy, and it's the main focus of the Albanese government's economic plan. That's why we delivered a responsible budget so that the government isn't adding to inflationary pressures in our economy. And that includes returning 87% of revenue upgrades across 2 budgets to the budget bottom line. It's why we showed spending restraint. It's why we have gone about managing the budget in a responsible way. And it's why we've designed our cost of living relief, whether it's cheaper medicines, cheaper early childhood education, energy bill relief, to help people under the pump without adding to the inflation challenge in our economy. Our cost of living package will directly reduce inflation by 3/4 of a percentage point in 23/4 and not add to broader inflationary pressures in our economy. This is the point that the Treasury Secretary was making in Senate estimates earlier today. Now, Treasury's advice is that our fiscal policy is working with monetary policy to tackle inflation in the near term. Secretary Kennedy said at the estimates hearing today that fiscal policy was contractionary, that monetary policy, when it comes to monetary policy, it's important that fiscal policy doesn't make that job any harder, and I don't believe it is in this budget. He talked about the net effect of the budget being of the cost of living package to lower headline inflation, and lowering headline inflation is a useful outcome, let alone for the people who are suffering from those higher prices at this time. So we think that net effect is a downward impact on inflation. He said later on, we don't believe the budget as a whole is inflationary or adding to inflationary pressures, Mr Speaker. Now, Mr Speaker, given the choice between taking the advice of the Treasury Secretary or taking the advice of the member for Hume, I think we made the right call. I think we made the right call, Mr Speaker. Now, as this side of the House understands, the primary causes of the inflation challenge are pressure on our supply chains combined with a war in Ukraine. We know that headline inflation peaked in quarterly terms under those opposite, and we know in annual terms it peaked below most major advanced economies, lower than the UK, US, Italy, Germany and Canada. Now, tomorrow, Mr Speaker, we receive the monthly CPI indicator from the ABS, and we know that this is a volatile measure. It can bounce around from month to month, as the Secretary said today. But we do know that the peak in inflation is behind us. We've seen some moderation since last year, and while it will be higher than we'd like for longer than we'd like, it's continued to moderate over the year and years ahead. We take seriously, Mr Speaker, our responsibility to people doing it tough, and the budget reflected that.
Order. Give the call to the honourable member for McKellar.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Last year, former Victorian Police Commissioner Christine Nixon was commissioned to investigate Australia's migration system. In your own words, that system is currently being used to facilitate some of the worst crimes that can be conducted, such as human trafficking and sex slavery. It was promised that this report would be made public before the last budget. My question is, why hasn't the report been released publicly yet, and when will it be released? Thank you.
The Minister for Home Affairs and the Minister for Cybersecurity has the call.
Thank you, Speaker. And can I really genuinely thank the member for McKellar for this question. She's right. There are some absolutely terrible things that we inherited in the immigration system, and there is a very large volume of work occurring on this matter at the moment. If I can just give the parliament a little bit of context, we arrived in government a year ago to find the immigration system in an absolute mess. We had 1 million unprocessed visas in the system. We had an explosion of low-wage temporary migration that we saw under the Leader of the Opposition when he was running this portfolio. And as the member points out, we had clear evidence that this system was being used to facilitate terrible crimes that I don't think anyone in this parliament would defend. And the worst of those were instances of human trafficking and sexual exploitation, and this broken migration system was right at the heart of those crimes being committed. right under the nose of the Leader of the Opposition, who sits opposite me. Now, there is an enormous amount of work underway to address these concerns at the moment, so it wasn't just the Nixon review, although I'll speak to that in just a second. We asked Australian Border Force to stand up a new task force to address some of these issues, Operation Inglenook. Operation Inglenook has been enormously successful. They have done somewhere just over 50 major disruptions of incidents where they believe that some of these issues are present in Australia at the moment. They've stopped people at the border, they have cancelled visas, they've dealt with a number of very shoddy migration agents who we know are at the centre of this problem, so there's been some very good practical action. But of course the system itself has facilitated this, and that's why I asked Christine Nixon, who is probably the toughest cop that certainly we've seen in Victoria, to look at this review. I'd like to just acknowledge her work. It's been very much of assistance to the government in thinking about how we're going to address these issues. So the government is actively considering the recommendations of the review at the moment. We will release the review and the government's response to that review shortly. I'm very happy to speak to the member in private before the review is released, and also afterwards to talk to her about some of these very important issues facing our country. Thank you.
Give the call to the honourable member for Hasluck.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. How is the Albanese government working with the Government of Western Australia to deliver real benefits and a better future for Western Australians?
Give the call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for Hasluck for her question and for the contribution that she's making to the connections between the federal Labor government and the WA government. And today I want to take the opportunity to pay tribute to a great leader of a great state, in my friend Mark McGowan. He has left office as he led, on his own terms, his own person. He steered Western Australia through an unprecedented time. He did that with courage and with leadership. His conviction and strength in shielding WA made him a target for bad faith operators. We know about the Clive Palmer lawsuit that occurred that was backed by the former government of the coalition. I chose to stand with Mark McGowan and did it proudly, because the government that I lead will also continue to work constructively with WA to deliver real lasting benefits to West Australians. Already we're delivering 7 urgent care clinics, including 2 regional clinics, saving more than $8.6 million from 785,000 prescriptions since January 1. Our bulk billing investments will help 1.16 million eligible West Australians. 111,000 families will benefit in WA from cheaper childcare from 1 month's time. 18,800 fee-free safe places have been delivered already, with more to come. 26,500 aged care workers are getting a pay rise in WA. 6,700 single parents are benefiting from the change that we've made in WA alone. In WA, 79,000 households will receive increased rent assistance. 498,000 households are eligible for a $350 rebate on their energy bill, something opposed by those opposite. $2.8 billion has been provided for infrastructure, including the Tonkin Highway, the Pilbara Ports and Metronet as well. 132,000 homes in WA alone will benefit from full fibre NBN access. 380,000 small businesses with an annual turnover of $10 million will increase their instant asset write-off asset threshold to $20,000. And around 90,000 small businesses will receive bill relief of $650 from the 1st of July. Mr Speaker, we will continue to work with the WA government. My government had a full cabinet meeting in Port Hedland and will have one in coming months in Perth. We understand that to represent the whole nation, you have to actually deliver for the whole nation, and we are delivering for Western Australia.
Call to the member for Hume.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister.
Order.
UBS data shows that in the last month alone, the price of Vegemite has increased by 8%, peanut butter by 9%, yoghurt has increased by 12%. Having promised to take responsibility, Will the Prime Minister apologise to Australians for failing to take pressure off inflation, meaning Australians will pay more at the checkout?
Order. There's far too much noise. I'm going to ask the member for Hume to restate the question because I couldn't hear it. There is far too much noise on my left. I want to have complete silence so these questions can be heard.
Delighted to repeat the question to the Prime Minister.
I give the call to the member for Hume, who will be heard in silence.
My question is to the Prime Minister. UBS data shows that in the last month alone, the price of Vegemite has increased by 8%, peanut butter by 9%, and yoghurt has increased by 12%. Having promised to take responsibility, will the Prime Minister apologise to Australians for failing to take pressure off inflation, meaning Australians will pay more at the checkout?
Give the call to the Prime Minister.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the Shadow Treasurer for the question. He seems incapable of asking a question of the Treasurer. And
Order.
They of course spent their budget estimates last week asking the big questions about what T-shirts people were wearing and all the other nonsense that they carried on with.
Order.
Opposite.
Members on my right.
Mr Speaker, this is the paradox of the Shadow Treasurer. Lightweight but dense. Lightweight but dense, Mr Speaker. The fact is that when you look at Australia's performance, he's asked about inflation. Well, he should know, because the CPI jumped 2.1% in the March 2022 quarter on his watch, the largest quarterly rise this century. The notable price rises in the quarter included automotive fuel 11%, beef 7.6%, vegetables 6.6%, fruit 4.9%, and non-durable grocery products 6.7%. That's what occurred. And then
the Prime Minister will pause, who is referring to the prices of goods, which was included in the question about Vegemite and butter and yoghurt. The peanut butter. Order. Order. The member for Page. The manager. The Shadow Treasurer on a point of order.
Well, relevance, Mr Speaker, is a very specific question asking the Prime Minister to take responsibility.
The Prime Minister is being relevant because the question at the end said about Australians paying more at the checkout, and the Prime Minister is giving detailed information about goods and services at the checkout. That is relevant to the question. He could not be more relevant. Give the call to the Prime Minister.
In the 12 months to March quarter 2023, the Shadow Treasurer likes to talk about the G7. He thinks we're a member. But when you have a look at what the G7 countries and you compare us with them, the fact is I'm asked about food. And of the G7 countries, this is where they're at. Canada, 10.5. France, 15.6.
The Deputy
Germany,
and the Shadow Treasurer will cease
Italy,
interjecting.
13. UK, 18.1. United States, 9.9. Every single one of those countries has higher food inflation. You can't be more specific than this, than Australia. Every single one, Australia's performance has been better at. And I note that at the National Press Club, the Shadow Treasurer was asked, why was inflation something that was out of the Coalition's control but is now, as you say, able to be controlled by Labor, especially given the war in Ukraine is still going? What was his answer? It said it all. Well, the key to answering that question is that we're not in government, Labor is now.
Order.
Says it all about this lightweight Shadow Treasurer.
Order. Order. Members on my right will cease interjecting. The member for Hume, if he continues to interjecting, will be warned. So I can hear from the member for Bennelong.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Climate Change and Energy. How will Australians benefit from the Albanese Labor government's action on energy prices? What has been the response to the government's action, and what approaches has the government rejected?
Give the call to the Minister for Climate Change and Energy.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. I thank my honourable friend for his question and his leadership on matters of climate change and energy. I'm looking forward to joining his electrification forum in a couple of weekends' time. But, Mr Speaker, in relation to our energy relief plan, I'm happy to report to the honourable member that in our home state of New South Wales, for example, increases of 40% that were predicted have now, for those households which have received our rebates negotiated with the states, has changed to an 8% reduction, Mr Speaker, from a 40% increase to an 8% reduction, which on average for a family in New South Wales equates to $843, the impact of our intervention of relief. And we know that this has had a very substantial impact. We've heard from the Secretary of the Treasury that our energy relief package has reduced inflation by 0.75%, and half of the percent, is a result of the coal and gas caps which have been opposed by those opposite. We heard from the energy regulator, the Australian energy regulator, last week that the intervention would have has seen prices changes from 50% increases down to around 20%. And we've seen also AEMO note the impact of the government's intervention, the impact of our intervention to reduce power price rises. I'm asked if we have rejected any alternative approaches, and we have. The approach from the Leader of the Opposition, who said at APIA he would rip up this intervention, that he would repeal it. Now, why would a Leader of the Opposition possibly do such a thing? Why would he repeal an intervention which has seen increases of 40% change to a reduction of 8%? Well, I think I might have worked it out. I think the Leader of the Opposition has been receiving poor advice from his shadow minister. His shadow minister was on Sunday agenda and he was asked about these price rises. And at first he denied them. He denied the impact of our energy price relief, and then he had a different. And then he had a different.
Member.
Then he had a different alibi. He said, and I quote:
Minister will pause for a moment. The member for Fairfax is warned. If he says one more thing during question time, you simply cannot yell while a minister is speaking. And same with the member for Hume, who has the MPI, will not be saying another word for the rest of question time, I'm sure. The minister has the call and will be heard in silence.
Mr Speaker, the member for Fairfax went on to say, so there's no evidence here that the intervention itself was the thing that got prices down. No evidence that the intervention itself was the thing that got prices down. This creates a considerable mystery. What was it? Was it the coronation, Mr Speaker? Was it the final episode of Succession, perhaps? No spoilers. Was it Sweden winning the Eurovision Song Contest? Was it the honourable member's videos from Fukushima and Hiroshima promoting nuclear energy? I mean, what was it that could have got energy prices down over the last 6 months, Mr Speaker? What possibly could it have been? What possibly could it have been?
Order.
Perhaps it was the intervention designed to do just that, which honourable members opposite opposed with every bit of energy they could muster, that they would repeal at the first opportunity. Perhaps it is the rebates and the coal and gas price caps which we imposed on the energy markets, Mr Speaker. Perhaps that's what done it. Perhaps that is what reduced the price rises.
Concluded. Thank goodness. Give the call to the member for Gippsland.
Thank you, Speaker. And my question is to the Prime Minister. And I refer to his answer in question time last Thursday, where he said, and I quote, "Through the National Reconstruction Fund, we specifically set aside funding to support the forestry industry." Prime Minister, how does the National Reconstruction Fund support timber workers and their families in the native hardwood timber industry?
The call to the order. Order. Members on my left. The Minister for Industry and Science has the call. Order. Members on my left. The member for Deakin is now warned. The Minister for Industry and Science has the call.
Thank you, Speaker, and thank you for the member for Gippsland for the question. Obviously, we want to see manufacturing jobs grow, and particularly in our regions.
Order.
It's why in the Reconstruction Fund, which we're very happy to get a question on, would have been great to get your support for. We wanted, in particular, to support value add in resources and in ag in particular, and within agriculture, we targeted forestry.
Order.
Get to it. Patience.
Order.
And we did want to provide for value add in those products.
Come on.
40 seconds.
The minister will
For real?
pause. I'm going to be firm on this. The minister is directly answering the question and mentioning parts of the question. So I'm going to hear from the member for Gippsland.
Thank you, Speaker. And the point of order is on relevance. The question specifically referred to the native hardwood timber industry and the National Reconstruction Fund. I do invite the minister to be relevant to the issue of the native hardwood timber industry, which the Prime Minister indicated last week would benefit from the reconstruction.
The minister can continue. Order.
And again,
Order.
I come to the point. There will be other products that may be manufactured, produced here in this country using different sources of timber, and we will.
Order.
We will.
Order. Members on my left. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition will cease interjecting.
We want to ensure. We want to ensure that that manufacturing occurs onshore. Now, it's a bit rich, Speaker, for them to suddenly come here and ask what the Reconstruction Fund will be able to do for regional communities when they never, ever backed the fund, never prepared to back manufacturing and were not prepared to engage in this. We will be able, either from a variety of different sources, either native hardwoods through to plantation, if there are products where we want to be able to value add and produce those products here onshore, we want to support that. It would have been nice to get their support. Instead, they want to be able to do what they always do, say no, do nothing, and then criticise at the end.
Give the call to member for Gilmore.
My question is to the Minister for Aged Care. What has the Albanese Labor government done to address the aged care crisis it inherited and lay the foundations for a better sector that delivers the quality care that older Australians deserve?
Call to the Minister for Aged Care and Sport.
I thank the member for Gilmore for her question, and I was pleased that she was able to deliver the good news of the aged care pay rise recently with Assistant Minister Carney at Uniting Osborne House, Nowra. Our historic $36 billion aged care budget proves our commitment to workers, to residents, to care recipients, to their family and to their friends. A budget that included a massive and unprecedented 17% increase to residential aged care funding through the AN-ACC funding model, an $11.3 billion increase to minimum award rates of dedicated aged care workers by a much-needed, much-deserved 15%, an additional 9,500 home care packages to allow people to age at home for longer, and $112 million to improve access to GPs for aged care residents. Excellent. And much more. And in response to our aged care budget, CEO of Baptist Care New South Wales and ACT, Charles Moore, said, investment in the aged care sector creates value, not just for the individuals receiving care, but for their families, for the community and for the economy. Catholic Health Chief Executive Pat Garcia described our budget measures to the Australian as a game changer for aged care. Mr Garcia said after this budget, aged care providers are reassessing the once questionable viability of facilities in light of these new numbers, these new numbers in the aged care budget. Mr Speaker, one of my favourite parts of this job is getting out of this building and talking to aged care residents and workers on the ground. And in the last 12 months, I've been to homes in every state and territory. And in the week after budget, I travelled to Cairns and to Townsville and to Darwin to give the good news to aged care workers about what this budget contained for them. And let me tell you, those aged care workers were ecstatic. Finally, they feel as if they're being properly recognised for their complex, their skilled and their critical work. It means workers like Josie from Palmerston, who has been working for 32 years in aged care and talks about her residents as her heart and her soul, will be getting a 15% pay rise. Mr Speaker, we were elected a year ago and we promised to lift this sector out of crisis. And in our first 12 months, we've addressed 69 recommendations of the Royal Commission. That is almost half, including Recommendation 133, more stringent reporting requirements, Recommendation 120, a new funding model for residential aged care, 11 and 115, setting up the new independent pricing authority, number 86, minimum care time standards and 24/7 nurses, number 77, setting up a new national registration regime. We are taking the action that the Coalition refused to take in 9 long years and doing the work to lift aged care out of crisis finally.
Call to the member for Flinders.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Under the government's price increase announced last week, the average Victorian will pay a further 25% more on their energy, or $532 more for a residential customer. Why are the Prime Minister's broken promises making things so much worse for Middle Australia?
Good question. Give the call to the Minister for Energy and Climate Change and Energy.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for her question about the impact of the DMO that was announced last week. And the first point to make is that the average Victorian household receives a saving of $555 because of the intervention of this side of the House, which the honourable member and all her colleagues voted against. All her colleagues voted against. And maybe the honourable member has a view about what brought about that price reduction, Mr Speaker. Maybe she could help the member for Fairfax, who thinks it's a mystery as to how price increases could turn around and become price decreases for those families that have received the rebates negotiated by the Commonwealth and the states. And the honourable member referred to an announcement by the government last week. A gentle correction for the honourable member. It was an announcement by the Australian Energy Regulator, as she was required to do under the timing prescribed by the law. And the law says it shall be the 25th of May or the nearest business day thereafter. That wasn't always the law. That wasn't always the law. It used to be an earlier date. It used to be an earlier date, earlier in May, but there was a change last year. That was in a regulation that was promulgated by one of the then Ministers for Energy, Mr Speaker, one of the then Ministers for Energy, who changed the regulation to say it was a very simple regulation, 2 lines.
The Minister will not use
substitute the first business day after May 25th. Now May 25th comes after May 21st, Mr Speaker, and May 21st was a key date, and the Minister for Energy then did not want the 20% energy price rises to be made public to the Australian people before May 21st, because he knew the Australian people would have a view about that at the ballot box. So if honourable members opposite are going to ask this side of the House about energy prices, they might want to have a little word to the member for Hume and ask him why he changed the law of this country to hide price rises before the last election. Why did he do that? Well, I think the answer is pretty obvious, because he was embarrassed, because he was ashamed. Now he says it wasn't my fault. It wasn't my fault. He signed the regulation. He signed the regulation. There's 2 signatures. There's 2 signatures.
Order. The Minister will pause. Order. The Leader of the Opposition. Order. The Leader of the Opposition. Point of order.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Well, it's on relevance. Australians are hurting at the moment, and this minister is trying to tell them that their power bills are going down when they know that they are going up and up and up.
The Leader of the Opposition has a lot of latitude, but that is an abuse of standing order. I'm just going to bring the minister back to relevance to the question. He's referring to power prices, and I'm just asking him to continue.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr Speaker. And the DMO last week was issued in accordance with the law, not the law that was changed by this side of the House, but the law that was signed by the previous minister. Only 2 signatures, his own and the Governor-General's. We don't blame the Governor-General. We blame the previous minister. Now, that is the fact, Mr Speaker. They hid price rises. They were not honest with the Australian people. We have been clear with the Australian people that energy prices are under pressure around the world. Governments around the world are intervening, including this government, and we're intervening against the wishes of those opposite.
The member for Hume, I did gently remind him before that if he continues to interject, he won't be here, which means the MPI won't continue. I can't be any clearer than that. So that means no more interjections for the remainder of question time. Okay. I give the call to the member for Fremantle.
Thank you, Speaker. And my question is to the Minister for the Environment and Water. How is the Albanese Labor government...
No, the member will resume his seat. When questions are being asked to ministers, I have been through this many times. It is not a time to groan, to give comment. It is to be in silence so I can hear the question. For some reason, when certain ministers are asked, there's always an audible groan. It is not going to continue. Otherwise, I'll take action. So we're just going to start it again so I can hear from the member for Fremantle without commentary of who the question is to. Give the call to the member for Fremantle.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And my question is to the Minister for Environment and Water. How is the Albanese Labor government taking action to deal with the problem of plastic pollution, both in Australia and on the world stage?
Give the call to the Minister for the Environment and Water.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Fremantle for his fantastic question. He is an absolutely committed environmentalist and a very keen recycler, I've noticed as well. So over the weekend, Mr Speaker, I was at the second session of the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee to develop an international legally binding instrument on plastic pollution, including in the marine environment, and it was terrific to be there with other nations, particularly those sharing our high ambition to end plastic pollution by 2040 globally. Plastic production, of course, is a strong contributor to greenhouse gas pollution. The pollution itself is bad for the environment, and of course it's also bad for human health. And it's a global problem. Pacific nations account for only about 1.3% of plastics use, but there is a floating plastic island of garbage in the Pacific that is about 3 times the size of France as those currents wash the rubbish into the ocean. If we don't take action now, the amount of plastic entering the ocean will triple by 2040, and on one estimate, by 2050, the plastic in the ocean will outweigh fish in the ocean. So as well as arguing on our own behalf, we were there emphasising the voice of Pacific nations that are very strongly committed to action on plastic pollution. Humans have produced about 8.5 billion tonnes of plastic, and about 9% of that has been recycled over the years. The rest has been burned, it's gone into landfill, or it's escaped into the environment where it lasts for thousands of years, sometimes into the oceans, filling up the gullets of seabirds, choking animals, starving them, or drowning them. But it also has impacts on human health. We're seeing microplastics and the chemicals from plastics turning up in human bloodstreams, in organs, in breast milk, in the placenta. In fact, the average Australian ingests about a credit card's worth of plastic a week. So, under the previous government, Australia made an admirable commitment to recycle 70% of our plastic packaging, but we have been stuck at 16% for 4 years. We have to do better. That's why we're investing in recycling infrastructure. We will almost double our recycling capacity by 2025. We're reforming the regulation of packaging by 2025 with the states and territories. We're backing the CSIRO's program to end plastic waste and working with the chief scientist on circularity. We're seeing the CEFC and the National Reconstruction Fund investing in recycling and remanufacturing. We're stepping up to get supermarkets to deal with the problem of soft plastics that has so troubled Australians. We're regulating the recycling of solar panels and electronic
Minister's time
goods as well.
Has concluded. Give the call to the member for Curtin.
My question is to the Minister for Science and Industry. Leading AI experts and industry leaders have warned that unregulated AI development presents profound risks to society and humanity. Last month you said you'd asked the National Science and Technology Council to think through what the implications are and how government should respond. But this is urgent. With every passing month, AI becomes more embedded in our economy and harder to regulate. When will we actually see AI development regulated in Australia?
The call to the Minister for Industry and Science.
Speaker, and thanks to the member for Curtin. And I know that you take a deep interest in these things and also the application of technology for good, having visited OncoRes with you and the work that they're doing on cancer detection and the use of technology in that way to make a difference in people's lives. And clearly, we want the safe and inclusive uptake of technology, particularly when it comes to artificial intelligence. Having been developed since the 50s, we've seen an accelerated development in the last few years, and when it comes to generative AI, notably around ChatGPT, we've seen that since its versions released through November through to now. That's obviously started to make people think about what other impacts there could be across a range of different fields. Now, the government did ask, through the Prime Minister, the National Science and Technology Council, to look at the growth of generative AI, particularly the use of large language models, and that work has been done. The government is also considering, across whole of government, how we are able to ensure that we get the best out of these technologies, but that we also recognise the risks and we curb them where we can. And so, for example, a few weeks ago we released our updated list of critical technologies, which highlighted AI, both in the category of providing an uplift for benefit, but also the things that do need to be managed. And I will be looking forward to releasing further details around the government's work to start building those guardrails even further and inviting public comment and engagement in the development of that process. We do need to absolutely get this right. We have been consulting widely on that. We're targeting responsible AI development and adoption in this country, particularly through the budget, where we're supporting small and medium enterprises adopt AI for the first time and to be able to think through how that technology is applied. We also provide additional funding, Member for Curtin, for the National AI Centre, and they're setting them on a sustainable footing, but also growing initiatives like the Responsible AI Network, again, bringing business, government, academia together to think through all these issues. So there's other work that's being done by Minister Gallagher as the Minister for Public Service, working on guidance around generative AI adoption. My colleagues, Minister Rowland and the Attorney-General, they've got important oversight of relationships between generative AI, online harms, privacy and copyright. So again, we're working on these issues and we'll be announcing further steps very soon.
Give the call to the honourable member for Lingiari.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Indigenous Australians. During Reconciliation Week, what can Australians do to promote reconciliation?
Give the call to the Minister for Indigenous Australians.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and thank you to the member for Lingiari. Like all of us here, I'm sure she saw the beautiful First Nations art projections on the front of Parliament House last night, and the avenue of flags, of those three flags flying. Be a voice for generations. That's the theme for this year's Reconciliation Week. It's a call for all of us to be a voice for reconciliation in tangible ways in our everyday lives, because the defining moments of our history have been when ordinary Australians have put their shoulder to the wheel of history and pushed it forward, and in doing so made Australia a better place. The 1938 Day of Mourning, the 67 referendum, Wave Hill, Mabo, the Apology to the Stolen Generations, the 1997 Reconciliation Convention, the walks over bridges, the Redfern speech, and of course the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Everyone can make an act of reconciliation, and sometimes it's actually the humble moments that make the biggest difference. By telling the truth of our past, by finally recognising Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in our Constitution, by giving a voice to Indigenous Australians, because the truth of our history is that Indigenous Australians have been left behind. We all know the indicators: the 9 years gap in life expectancy, the widening gap in infant mortality, lower rates of high school completion, and our young people robbed of their potential, languishing behind bars in a justice system that has let them down. It isn't good enough. Something has to change, and change for the better. In the coming months, there will be important conversations around dinner tables, the pub and coffee breaks, because this year there will be a referendum to recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders in our Constitution through a voice. And we have everything to gain and nothing to lose by voting yes at the referendum later this year. Australians know in their hearts the time is now. We want a more united Australia, a more reconciled Australia, and there is no better time than Reconciliation Week to start having those conversations, and for all of us to be a voice for generations. Now is the time for all Australians to put their shoulder to the wheel.
The call to the Manager of Opposition Business.
My question is to the Prime Minister. I refer to his answer last Thursday where he told the House the National Reconstruction Fund was an example of how his government is supporting timber workers. Given his government did a deal to specifically exclude the native hardwood timber industry from accessing the fund, did the Prime Minister mislead Parliament?
Order. Give the call to the Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I'm pleased to get that question. They voted against the National Reconstruction Fund. They voted against it. And in that, the member's question that you just asked, are we supporting timber workers? You bet we are. Absolutely. You bet we are.
Order.
And that's why we have, as part of the National Reconstruction Fund, $500 million for value-adding in agriculture, forestry, fisheries, food and fibre. That's why we have that. That's why we have that.
Order.
Now, the Victorian government have made a decision. They have made a decision to end native forest logging, and that is a decision for them.
Order.
What we are doing is making sure that we provide an avenue for increased investment in forestry through the National Reconstruction Fund.
Gippsland
that is very important because the member may be unaware, but around 90% of our forest products now come from plantations timber. Yep. We want to see more plantation forests and we want to see more jobs. We're investing $300 million to grow plantations, modernise our timber manufacturing infrastructure.
Prime Minister will order. The member for Gippsland is now officially warned. Will not interject anymore. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Point of order is on relevance. The question was very specific about the native hardwood timber industry. Is it supported under the National Reconstruction Fund? That was the question.
The question was about the National Reconstruction Fund supporting timber workers. The Prime Minister is talking about the issue and also the National Reconstruction Fund. So I'll listen carefully to his answer to make sure he's being relevant, but at this stage he is in order. He has the call to continue for the remaining time.
And apparently, according to those opposite, there aren't any timber workers in the sustainable forestry industry. That'd be news to the suppliers of Visy. That'd be the news to the workers of Tumbarumba. That'd be news to all those who work in the industry. Now, we on this side of the chamber brought forward a fund of $15 billion. Those opposite, of course, voted against it, like they vote against everything. They don't like being called the no-alition, so I won't do that. But the fact is that they vote no to everything, Mr Speaker, including the National Reconstruction Fund.
Call to the honourable member for order. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition is now officially warned. It applies to both sides of the chamber when questions are being asked that be heard in silence without interruptions or interjections. I want to hear from the member for Lyons in silence. Give him the call.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Skills and Training. How is the Albanese government working to give Australians the skills and training they need for secure and rewarding employment, and particularly in rural and regional Australia? And what's the response been to the government's policies?
Call to the Minister for Industry, The Minister for Skills and Training.
Well, thank you, Speaker. I'd like to thank the member for Lyons for his question, and it was great to catch up with the Sorell Council Mayor and others in his electorate only a month ago, as we talked about how you supply skills to local economies. I mean, these are not just macro decisions. They need to be granulated, and you need to work out ways to do so in local communities. And of course, we understood the massive skills deficit we inherited upon election. That's why we responded quickly to announce 180,000 fee-free TAFE and VET places, 150,000 of which are already filled, I'm happy to say. And of course, when you're making decisions to invest in education and training, you do need to have the right advice. And by creating Jobs and Skills Australia and accompanying Jobs and Skills Australia with 10 tripartite Jobs and Skills Councils, you actually get real economy insight into what is needed now and into the future. And for that reason, that creation of JSA and councils really does provide the advice that government needs, that industry needs, to invest in education in areas of existing and future demand. And of course, as a result of that, I think we're well placed. Now today, Jobs and Skills Australia released its latest quarterly market update, which reveals skill shortages are persistent in regional areas. And as people know, and indeed the Minister for Health and others have talked about these shortages with doctors and nurses, other care sector workers, essential service workers, retail, hospitality, wherever you look, in fact, across the regional economy, you do see these shortages. And therefore, it's absolutely critical that higher education and the VET sector supply skills to the labour market, and does so in areas like regions and rural communities. Now, that's why I'm happy to say of the 180,000 places, 150,000 filled, 48,000 of that 150,000 are filled by people in regional and rural communities. And that's absolutely critical. Nearly 1/3 of all of the 150,000 places are filled by people in regional and rural communities. Now, there is more to be done, but we'll continue to focus with states and territories, with industry to do so. But I just want to make the point that in the member for Lyons electorate, a person enrolling in a Cert 3 agricultural course doesn't have to find $2,500 to enrol in that course because of fee-free TAFE. That's why it's so important that we remove cost barriers to education and training in areas of demand. And in doing so, we provide the skills that workers need, we provide the skills that businesses are crying out for, and we provide the skills that our economy demands.
The call to the member for Fowler.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Prime Minister, you are a strong supporter of local government. Federal assistance grants used to be distributed to help the most disadvantaged local council communities based on the CEFA index. Fairfield Council in Fowler is rated as number 1 by the index. However, the previous New South Wales Liberal government changed the definition of disadvantage, resulting in funds being diverted to more favourable seats. What will your Labor government do to fix this inequity so that funding is prioritised for disadvantaged communities under CEFA?
I'll hear from the Prime Minister on a point of order.
Yeah, just with respect to the member for Fowler, that would appear to be a question about the actions of the former New South Wales Liberal government, and that is certainly not within my authority to change, nor is it in my authority to speak on behalf of the New South Wales government, current government.
I may just allow the member for Fowler to rephrase the question, understanding Order 98. We just need to make sure the question is relevant directly to the Prime Minister's responsibility, i.e. what he's responsible for. If another level of government or government has made a determination, the Prime Minister or Minister is not responsible for that decision. So I'll just allow the member for Fowler to perhaps rephrase the question to make it either directly relevant to the Prime Minister or the Minister responsible.
So I'll rephrase that. So you're a strong supporter of local government. The federal assistance grants used to be distributed to help the most disadvantaged local council communities based on the CEFA index. So Fairfield Council in Fowler is rated as number 1 by the index. However, what will the federal government do to ensure that funding will be allocated appropriately to local governments to prioritise disadvantaged communities under CEFA?
The question's in order, and I'll call the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for Fowler for her question, and I'm, to be frank, not aware of some of the details that she raises with regard to local government funding and changes that were made by, I think the member suggested, the former New South Wales government. But the member for Fowler is absolutely correct to say that I'm a supporter of local government, and that's why just in the coming month there will be a re-meeting of the Australian Council of Local Government where every single mayor and shire president will be meeting with the federal government, including all of my ministers, to make sure that you get that direct engagement involved. I'm a firm believer as well in needs-based funding for local government, and the Commonwealth Grants Commission make assessments based upon equity issues. And I'm also very conscious that an area such as Liverpool Council is a disadvantaged area and therefore should receive more support than some other areas that are in a stronger position to raise revenues themselves in their local communities due to the factors that the Commonwealth Grants Commission at arm's length determines for the funding arrangements. I'm also aware that, in my view, and this is something I've put for a long period of time, funding for local community infrastructure is best delivered through local government. It is local councils that know what the priorities of their local communities are, and they also have, of course, accountability mechanisms, including auditing and including proper processes to make sure that you don't have funding from government which advantage one private sector operator over another. You've seen that that can create real problems with integrity issues, and we saw that with colour-coded spreadsheets under the former government. What I believe is that in terms of those fundings being through local government are very important. This side of the House will always speak up for stronger relations with local government. And can I say this? I met with the local government minister just this morning, talking about her local community around Narooma, but also talking in general about the Australian Council of Local Government and how will it function, and I look forward to participating in that process as Prime Minister.
Give the call to the honourable member for Bean.
Speaker, my question is to the Attorney-General. What money laundering and terrorism financing risks does Australia face, and how are these risks made worse by the mess left by the former government?
Order. Give the call to the Attorney-General.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I do thank the member for Bean for his question. When we came to government over a year ago, we had significant work to do to clean up the mess left by those opposite. And one of those messes, which has extremely serious consequences for Australia's national security, for the criminal justice system and for the stability of our financial system, is the failure to progress money laundering reform. Despite knowing for years that reform to Australia's anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing regime was needed to respond to the changing threat environment and evolving international standards, the former government failed to lift a finger to undertake this necessary reform. And what this means is that Australia's financial system has been left vulnerable to criminal exploitation and it has weakened the overall integrity of Australia's anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing regime. Money laundering funds transnational and serious organised crime. Money laundering funds child exploitation, and money laundering funds terrorism. The failure to act to toughen Australia's laws by the opposition when they are in government has had the most serious of consequences. It's estimated that serious and organised crime costs the Australian community up to $60 billion each financial year. Money laundering affects the safety and well-being of Australian communities and exploits and distorts legitimate markets and economic activity. As the rest of the international community has strengthened their regulation of these sectors, Australia has fallen further behind. Since 2015, Australia has failed to comply with 16 out of 40 Financial Action Task Force standards, which include extending the anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing regime to Tranche 2 entities. This includes lawyers, accountants, trust and company service providers, real estate agents and dealers in precious metals and stones. And as a result, Australia now risks being grey-listed by the Financial Action Task Force, which could result in significant harm to our economy and threaten our links with international finance. But we are acting to fix this. Last month, the Albanese government commenced formal consultation on important and overdue reforms to Australia's anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing regime. The Albanese government is committed to protecting the integrity of this regime and the Australian financial system and ensuring we are meeting international standards. Unlike the former government, we won't tolerate exploitation of the Australian financial system by criminals and terrorists.
Call to the honourable member for Gippsland.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister, and I refer to the Prime Minister's previous answer, where he continues to mislead native hardwood timber workers and their families and suggests they will share in the National Reconstruction Fund. Prime Minister, that's not true, is it?
Order. Give the call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for his question. And I think I say to the member, this is directly what I said. You don't get to verbal someone through a question. Here is the House of Representatives. Here is the House of Representatives Hansard from last Thursday. This is what I said. That's why we, the Commonwealth Government, are investing $300 million to grow plantations, modernise our timber manufacturing infrastructure and build the skills of our forestry workforce. Tick.
Order.
I note that through the National Reconstruction Fund, we specifically set aside funding to support the forestry industry. Tick. But the member for Gippsland voted against it, and everyone here voted against it as well. Tick. Tick. That is what I said last Thursday. And the member came to this dispatch box and pretended that I said something else. That is the Hansard from last Thursday. I stand by those comments, and I stand by the National Reconstruction Fund. I stand by the $15 billion for manufacturing. I stand by the $3 billion for renewables and low emissions technologies. I stand by the $1.5 billion for medical manufacturing. I stand by the $1 billion for value adding in resources.
The member for Gippsland on a point of order.
Thank you, Speaker. And the point of order is on relevance. I did invite the Prime Minister to address his comments towards the native hardwood timber industry. He doesn't seem to understand.
Resume your seat. Resume your seat. No, that is an abuse of standing orders. The Prime Minister. You asked a question about the Prime Minister's comments in the Parliament. He referred directly to those and quoted his own words regarding the question. He cannot be more relevant if you're asking a question about his words and he says, this is what I said, and quotes it to the Parliament. Obviously, that's being relevant to the question. The question was about the National Reconstruction Fund. He's moving to that part of the question now. He's, of course, being relevant. So no more points of order about relevance. Give the Prime Minister the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. I stand by the fact that we're providing $1 billion for critical technologies. I stand by the fact that $1 billion will be provided for advanced manufacturing and $500 million for value adding in agriculture, forestry, fisheries, food and fibre. I stand by all of that. And I stand by my comment that they voted against every one of those funds. That's right. Every one of those funds. And unfortunately for the member for Gippsland, who I have respect for, he's been here a long time, that there's this thing called Hansard, and it records what you say. So if you're going to come to the dispatch box and make an allegation that there's been some misleading of Parliament, which he did in a question. You don't get to put your own words into my mouth. What you get to do is to ask a question and I get to answer it. I get to answer it and I answered it very clearly. I answered it completely accurately. And if the member doesn't understand that there's a link for all the workers throughout the timber industry, then I can't help him. He's beyond help, Mr Speaker. But the fact is they came here, this is their gotcha moment. This is their big gotcha. And the fact is they once again have failed. And if you think there's some misleading in terms of Parliament, there are appropriate methods for the member to operate.
Give the call to the member for McNamara.
Thank you very much, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Housing and Homelessness. How is the Albanese Labor government delivering on its ambitious housing commitments, and what obstacles may block further progress?
Give the call to the Minister for Housing, the Minister for Homelessness and the Minister for Small Business.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I do want to thank the member for McNamara for that question. I know that the member for McNamara wants more social and affordable rental homes in his electorate. Indeed, he has a large number of renters in his electorate and he's been working hard to deliver more homes for the people that need it most in his electorate. We do know that too many Australians are finding it difficult to find a safe, affordable place to call home. But, Mr Speaker, over the last 12 months, our government, the Albanese Labor government, has helped more than 50,000 Australians into home ownership. This includes more than 6,000 through our regional first home buyer guarantee that we brought forward, Mr Speaker. And, of course, we're making changes in July to expand the criteria for this.
Members on my left, Member Deakin's on a warning. If he says one more thing, he'll leave straight away. Continually interjecting on this minister, and it has got to stop. Now.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And we're making changes on the 1st of July to expand the program so that more Australians are eligible. Of course, we unlocked immediately the $575 million to build more social and affordable rental homes. And indeed, we have homes under construction today because we made that decision. In our first budget, the National Housing Accord, which includes funding for another 10,000 affordable rentals to be matched by the states and territories with another 10,000 affordable rentals. In the most recent budget, of course, we committed an additional $2 billion in financing for more social and affordable homes and changes to the build-to-rent to get more homes on the ground more quickly, Mr Speaker. We, of course, made changes to increase the largest increase in the Commonwealth rental assistance in more than 30 years, Mr Speaker. We're also delivering more than $1.6 billion in a one-year extension for the Housing and Homelessness Agreement. And we've also begun work on a National Housing and Homelessness Plan and our Help to Buy equity scheme. We've been making progress, Mr Speaker, but critical to our housing agenda is, of course, the Housing Australia Future Fund, Mr Speaker, a plan for tens of thousands, 30,000 in the first 5 years of the fund for social and affordable rental homes. And, Mr Speaker, we have had some issues in terms of the Senate and some of those opposite that opposed it in this House. We did get one member to cross the floor, but I've got an interesting letter, Mr Speaker, that I'd like to read to the House from the member for Dawson. The member for Dawson says, I understand that housing is a priority of the government's agenda and I'd like to discuss how the $10 billion Housing Australia Future Fund will provide specialist response to veterans at risk of homelessness, women and children escaping family violence and Indigenous housing in regional Australia. I'm very happy to have the conversation with the member for Dawson, and I'd say to the member for Dawson that the senators in his party should support it in the Senate. It's all very well to say that you want to access the fund, Mr Speaker, but you actually have to vote for it, Mr Speaker. I also understand there's been a bit of a meeting by some of the others on the other side. The members for Sturt, Menzies and Hughes apparently had a meeting. And I thought, oh, maybe they're actually interested in the Housing Australia Future Fund, Mr Speaker. Perhaps they actually want to get more homes on the ground more quickly. But no, it wasn't to be, Mr Speaker.
Has concluded. The call to the honourable member for Gippsland.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, will native hardwood timber workers receive direct support from your government?
The call to the Prime Minister.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. This is a dry gully that they're stuck in, Mr. Speaker. That they're stuck in. Having come here and asked a question suggesting that there was a misleading of Parliament last Thursday, they're now asking us, will we intervene over decisions that I said earlier on were decisions of the Victorian government. Not a decision by us.
Prime Minister is 30 seconds into his answer. He can pause for a moment so I can hear from the Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. This was a very tight question, given your recent and previous rulings. There's no wriggle room or the ability for the Prime Minister to have this confected outrage. He needs to answer the question specifically, because it goes to his conduct in this chamber.
Order. I'll hear from the Leader of the House. Order. I'll hear from the Leader of the House.
To the point of order, I'm not sure how it goes to what the Leader of the Opposition just said, because that wasn't in the question. But what was in the question was a question about how money will be expended and how the National Reconstruction Fund money will be used. That's where it went.
Order. The question was about support for timber workers receiving support from your government. Prime Minister is 30 seconds in. I'm going to listen to him carefully.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
And I'll make sure he is relevant to the question.
I refer the member to my answer of last Thursday that was accurate in every aspect, and included in that, I quote from last Thursday's answer: the Victorian government has a $200 million structural adjustment package in its budget. That is what I said last Thursday. That is the case today. What I have spoken about as well is our policy to provide support for the forestry sector through the National Reconstruction Fund, something that those opposite seem completely oblivious to. They come in here, they voted against it, and then they say it's not broad enough. You've already had a relevance.
The Prime Minister will pause. The Leader of the Opposition has raised a point of order on relevance. It can't be about that. So what is the point of order?
Well, Mr. Speaker, it goes to the direction that you gave the Prime Minister to be relevant. This couldn't have been a tighter question. And surely, if your ruling's been anything to this Leader of the government, he should answer it directly. It didn't allow for this ambiguity. It didn't allow for this rant and rave.
Resume your seat. Resume your seat. Order. That is the second time standing orders have been abused by the Leader of the Opposition, but out of the respect I have for his position, if there was anyone else, there'd be action taken. I'll ask the Prime Minister to continue regarding his answer regarding support for timber workers from his government. Native timber workers from... No. The Prime Minister... I know what the question is. I'm trying to listen to the Prime Minister, and I'm going to make sure he's relevant to the answer, and he has the call.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. He's very angry, Mr. Speaker. He's very angry. He can't help himself. And I'll give you just an example.
Member for Gippsland says one more thing.
I'll give you just an example of a grant that recently we put in through the member for Lyons. The member for Lyons, a great supporter of the forestry industry. The member for Lyons was there with the Agriculture Minister, Murray Watt, there at Western Junction Sawmill, a recipient of a $1.98 million grant from the program that we have put in place, the Accelerated Adoption of Wood Processing Innovation Grant Program, something that we have done. We will continue to provide support for timber workers across a range of areas, as well as acknowledge, of course, my answer from last Thursday with once again I reaffirm everything that I said in that answer.
The call to the member for Newcastle.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. And my question is to the Minister for Health. Has there always been uniform support for Medicare bulk billed GP services? And how is the Albanese Labor government ensuring that Australians continue to have access to bulk billed Medicare GP services?
Oh, here, Sharon.
Order. Give a call to the Minister for Health and Aged Care.
Thank you, Speaker, and I thank the member for Newcastle for her question. She's worked so hard to deliver better health care in her community, particularly with her Hunter Valley, Newcastle colleagues, the member for Shortland, member for Hunter and the member for Patterson. And on the weekend, Mr Speaker, Labor's Hunter team was able to announce the restoration of the region's nation-leading GP access after-hours service, a fully bulk-billed service delivered by the hard-working members of the Hunter GP Association for more than 20 years. But, Mr Speaker, funding cuts in 2020 and 2021 led to those services being reduced right across the region and actually closed altogether at the Mater Hospital in Newcastle on Christmas Eve of all times in 2021. But the government's decision to restore funding means that bulk billed service will reopen this week at the Mater Hospital in Newcastle, and operating hours will be extended at the Toronto Clinic in the member for Hunter's electorate as well, we can say. Now, across the country, Mr Speaker, after-hours services were scheduled to close across the country at the end of next month, after the former government failed to allocate a single dollar to after-hours services beyond the end of June. Not a single dollar across their third, fourth and fifth years of the forward estimates. But our budget, Mr Speaker, 3 weeks ago provided a lifeline across the country to all of those after-hours services. Good quality bulk billed services, Mr Speaker, particularly after hours, means that patients can get good quality care when they need it, where they need it, taking pressure off local hospital emergency departments. That's why, in addition to extending after-hours services, a $3.5 billion investment to triple bulk billing incentives was the centrepiece of our budget strengthening Medicare package, because for Labor, bulk billing is the beating heart of Medicare. And we know that tripling the bulk billing incentive will be a game-changer for general practice, certainly a game-changer for towns like Cessnock and the member for Hunter's region, where the total fee for a standard bulk bill GP consult will go up by 50%. From $50 to $75, a game-changer for millions of mums and dads across the country who want the confidence that their kids, when they're sick, can go and see a bulk bill doctor, a game-changer for millions of pensioners and concession card holders as well. Mr Speaker, Labor's approach in strengthening Medicare could not be more different from the approach of those opposite, led as they are today by a man who, after all, tried to abolish bulk billing altogether and make every single Australian pay every single time they went to see a doctor his infamous GP tax.
And I call the Prime Minister.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. I ask further questions to be placed on the notice paper.